well as just a general interest in history and her family history, which she'll tell you about. I think you'll find the presentation to be extremely interesting, both from the point of view of preservation and family history and World War II history. So, Margaret?
So again, my name is Margaret Guzek, and the name of the presentation is Rising from the Ashes, the Rebuilding of Warsaw Post-World War II. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background. I actually have a master's degree from Northwestern, which is in Evanston. We actually have a student from Northwestern who is filming today. So my background is journalism and writing. I've been doing a lot of architectural surveys, as well as landmark nominations for the National Register and local preservation ordinances. And this presentation kind of brings that aspect together because in 1945, when World War II was over, the Germans razed 85% of Warsaw. And there was a lot of debate on whether it could even be reconstructed, but it really was the will of the people that Warsaw be reconstructed. And they did a meticulous restoration over, probably when it was all said and done, it lasted until 1980, the late 1970s. And in 1980, because the restoration was so meticulous, it was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And then my family history, which I've really started researching in the past year or two, and I've started a book combining all of this. And I'll tell you a little bit about that because it kind of sets the foundation also, is all four of my grandparents are from Poland, and they're all World War II survivors. My father's mother was half Jewish, and her parents, they were from a town called Ostrów-Mazowiecka, which is 55 miles east of Warsaw. It was about 80% Jewish, and her parents were executed pretty much immediately when the Germans occupied. Her and her older sister, by then, were already in Warsaw, and they became members of the Polish resistance. You know, one, they were half Jewish, so it was a way to survive. Her older sister, one day disappeared when there were a lot of trains leaving for Warsaw, and she was taken to a concentration camp. We don't know which one, and they never saw her again. By that time, my grandmother was married to my grandfather, who was Polish Catholic, and so she continued in the resistance. And then she became pregnant, and obviously she couldn't really be in the resistance while pregnant, so my grandfather hid her in the forest in a shed for 9 months until she gave birth to the baby. And after a couple months, the baby, which was a boy, passed away because the Germans were intentionally starving the Polish people, and so the baby didn't survive. She rejoined the resistance, and she fought in the Warsaw Uprising, which we'll get into later. And then, just really quickly, my mom's parents were on the eastern side of Poland. So they were on the side that Russia took over, and they were put in Siberian labor camps. And when Russia switched sides in the war, the prisoners in the Siberian labor camps were released. And so my grandmother on my mother's side went to Africa with their 7-year-old son because it was a safe place to be during the war, while my grandfather went to Italy to fight on the Allied side. And then the boy came down with malaria in Africa, and by the time they could get him to London, which they finally did, he passed away in London. So my father was born and raised in Warsaw. He came over to the States when he was about 21. And my mother, who is 100% Polish also, she was raised in London because after the war was over, her parents did not want to go back to Poland. So it just kind of gives a little bit of a foundation on why I put this presentation together. And I'm in the middle of a book that will incorporate this presentation. So here you've got Warsaw in 2014, and then you have what Warsaw looked like in 1945, which was when Russia, you know, people call it a liberation, you know, but it really wasn't a liberation. It passed from one regime, which was the German regime, to communism. So unfortunately, Poland, to a certain degree, was a sacrificial lamb in the war. And that is what Warsaw looked like when finally Russia did liberate it in January of 1945. Now, the Germans, they razed 85% of Warsaw, and we'll get into later in the presentation how it breaks down during the war and what percent happened when. But a lot of people have a misconception. They say, well, other cities also were destroyed and razed to the ground during the war. And there's a large difference, and that's true. But the other cities, it was in the midst of the fighting. Warsaw was the only city when all the fighting was over, where the Germans so hated the Polish people that they went building by building in retaliation for the Warsaw Uprising and bombed the city. And that was again after the fighting was over. So, you know, to kind of understand Poland's precarious situation throughout history, you know, historians always say that Poland suffers from the disease of geography. And as you can see, that's true. It's right dead center in the middle of Germany and the USSR. So Warsaw is actually in the middle, pretty much in the center of Poland. And it was the largest city in Poland. Krakow was the second largest city. And Krakow actually managed to survive the war, and actually when the war was over, the Russians did liberate Krakow before the Germans, which they intended to destroy Krakow before they were able to do. And we'll get into later in the presentation, is that the Russians intentionally let Germans destroy Warsaw. And we'll get into that later in the presentation. So again, to understand Poland's position throughout history, it's in the center of Germany and USSR. And on August 23rd, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed between Germany and Russia, which basically, there were many stipulations in this treaty agreement, but one of them was that they would divide Poland, that Germany would invade from the west, and that the USSR would invade Poland from the east. So on September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and on September 17th, 1939, Russia invaded Poland on the other side. So by the time the war was over, 85% of Warsaw was razed. And that wasn't an accident. Hitler had this idea and plan to raze and destroy the people of Warsaw as well as the city before the war even started. On August 22nd, 1939, Hitler authorizes his commanders to kill without pity or mercy all men, and this is a quote from him, without pity or mercy, all men, women, and children of Polish descent or language. Only in this way can we obtain the living space, Lebensraum, we need. Hitler's intent with Warsaw was that he wanted to turn Warsaw into a model Nazi city. So he would exterminate, a little bit of misconception too, in Poland. Poland had the largest pre-war Jewish population next to New York. 3.8 million Jewish people in Poland. But in addition to Hitler obviously disliking Jewish people, he very much disliked Poles. And 6 million lives were lost in Poland, 3 million Jewish and then 3 million non-Jewish lives in Poland. So his plan from the beginning was not just to kill the Jewish people in Poland, but really to kill everybody. And his plan was to turn Warsaw into a model Nazi city. And as you can tell, Warsaw, which is on the left-hand side, is divided by the Vistula River. So on the west side of this, there's the Vistula River. On the west side of the Vistula River would be the model city that he was planning for after the war. And then on the east side of the Vistula River, there would be a slave labor camp. Basically, for the few Polish people that managed to survive, he would put them in a labor camp to serve the model city on the western side. So this is just the destruction map of what Warsaw looked like, with 85% of the city razed, and it just kind of highlights in color where this is the west side of the Vistula, where most of the destruction took place, as you can see in kind of the brighter red. On the eastern side of the Vistula River, which is actually where the Russian troops who were supposed to liberate Warsaw, but then decided not to, they stayed on the eastern side of the Vistula River waiting for Germany to do the destroying of Warsaw. And so not as much was destroyed on the east side of the Vistula River. So these are, the next couple of slides are just some photographs from a book that I have that actually is out here in the hallway. There's actually quite a few books too that the library put together on this subject as well.
Could you talk into the mic?
Oh, sorry, okay. So these are some photos that I put together of what Warsaw looked like right after the destruction by Germany. I think it gives you an idea of just how bad it was. As I mentioned before, well, I don't think I mentioned this actually. The pre-war population of Warsaw was 1.3 million, and after the war was over, probably January of 1945, 162,000 inhabitants. But by then, some people who had left Warsaw to go to the country, because a lot of people, when the Warsaw Uprising started, the beginning of August, women were fighting in the Warsaw Uprising too, but many women weren't. So, obviously the men that were fighting told their wives or their families to leave Warsaw because you didn't obviously want to be in Warsaw for those couple of months. It was not a good situation. So this is actually when people started to come back from the countryside into Warsaw. Right when the fighting was over, very few people in Warsaw because of the destruction. I don't know if anybody's seen the movie The Pianist, but it's very, very realistic. When you saw people coming out of the rubble, it was just so stunning because you just didn't expect that somebody could survive that. There's actually a name for the people who managed to live in that rubble and then come out of it, and they're called the Robinson Crusoes of Warsaw. So this is the breakdown of that 85%. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland. 12% of the buildings are damaged. In 1943 is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and an additional 12% of buildings are razed by the Germans. August 1st to October 5th, 1944 is the Warsaw Uprising, and an additional 30% of the buildings in Warsaw are destroyed. And then from October 1944 to January 1945, German retaliation for the Warsaw Uprising, and an additional 30% of the buildings are intentionally razed by the Nazi Army. So I want to, there is a misconception going on for a lot of years after the war. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising is different from the Warsaw Uprising. For many years, a lot of people outside of Poland thought they were one and the same, because when the war was over and communism took over Poland, it was forbidden for you to talk about the Warsaw Uprising. Teachers in Poland could not. It was against the law to teach it. It was against the law to talk about the Warsaw Uprising, and it was eliminated from history books. The communists and Stalin wanted to pretend that the Warsaw Uprising never happened. So they were okay with the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, people commemorating and remembering that, but not the Warsaw Uprising. So for a lot of years, until 1989, when Poland finally became free, and they were able to recognize officially the Warsaw Uprising. So this is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. We'll get into that a little bit later too, as far as what happened to the site that the Warsaw Ghetto was on, because in 1943 it was razed by the Germans. But the Warsaw Ghetto was basically the largest Jewish ghetto in Europe during the Holocaust. 300 to 400,000 Jewish people lived in the ghetto. In 1942, Hitler ordered all Jewish people in Warsaw to move into the ghetto. It served as a transport station to extermination camps. And in 1943, in April, word got out that it was going to be the final step as far as the Warsaw Ghetto, that Hitler planned to send everybody anybody left to extermination camps, and that he was going to raze the site. So at that point, the Jewish resistance broke out, and the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising happened. And it went from April 19th to May 16th, and obviously unsuccessful. And you know, they knew that they would be going into it, but it was just a final act of defiance. And Holocaust Remembrance Day, which was just 2 weeks ago. You know, different countries have different dates for Holocaust Remembrance Day, but Israel actually has their Holocaust Remembrance Day to coincide with the start of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So this is some photos from the Warsaw Uprising, which lasted 63 days from August 1st to October 2nd. I kind of talk a little bit about the role of the Soviet Army and the Western Allies. The Home Army of Warsaw, the Polish resistance, decided to start the uprising on August 1st because they got word that Russian troops were advancing on Warsaw and they were going to push Germany out. And that's why they felt it was important to coincide with that. So they started the Warsaw Uprising. Again, this is the Polish resistance, the Home Army, on August 1st, only to find out that the Soviet Army decided not to liberate Warsaw. They decided to stay on the east side of the Vistula River and watch Germany destroy Warsaw and its people. The Western Allies, unfortunately, it was a case of too little too late. They didn't help at the beginning. They did help towards the end, but by then it was too late. And again, there's a lot of history in that, you know, Poland really became a sacrificial lamb in the war. The role of female members of the Polish resistance, I think, is very important to commemorate because female members of the Polish resistance did fight in the Warsaw Uprising as shooters. They didn't just have a secondary position. And Golda Meir, one of the prime ministers of Israel, women have to fight in have to be in the Israeli army for 1 year. And if the troops are called up, women have to fight, and there was resistance from women in Israel. And Golda Meir used the female fighters in the Warsaw Uprising as an example, saying, look what they did for their country, you should be proud to fight for your country as well. And it helped to motivate them. So, in 1945, you know, 85% of Warsaw is razed, and it was such destruction that they just didn't really know if they could rebuild. But as more and more Polish people came back, and by December of 1945, the population of Warsaw was about 470,000. It really became the will of the Polish people to rebuild. And I guess somewhat surprisingly is that Russia agreed. They weren't going to help fund it, and the United States put forth the Marshall Plan, which was a financial plan to help European cities rebuild. And Russia forbid Poland to participate in the Marshall Plan, so they didn't get any outside money for the rebuilding efforts. But a lot of money came from Polish people within Poland and outside of Poland. So the reconstruction efforts began, and original bricks were brought in from other cities that were destroyed to help in the rebuilding efforts. Components of historic buildings that were able to be salvaged were used, and we'll get more into that a little bit later. And one of the biggest things is that because it was so destroyed, they needed something to kind of base their reconstruction on. And there was a famous painter. His name's Bernardo Volato. And he painted 26 paintings of Warsaw that were completed between 1770 and 1780. And they were representations of the architecture of Warsaw. And they used his paintings as the basis for their reconstruction. And then in addition, members of one of the universities in Warsaw during the war, they were able to get out some documents from the universities before they were destroyed that helped with the